During Ohio State's season opener, the Buckeyes will recognize the 2002 Ohio State National Championship winning team. Players will come back, coaches will come back. It will be a time of nostalgia for a lot of people in the stadium. And in today's show, we're going to do a little reminiscing of ourselves, looking back at that team, and hear some stories about what took place during that season that made that year so special. You don't want to miss this episode of Locked on Buckeyes.
You are Locked on Buckeyes, your daily podcast on the Ohio State Buckeyes. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, Buckeye fans? Welcome back to another episode of Locked on Buckeyes, part of Locked on Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jay Stevens, also the host of the Jay Stevens Podcast. It is Friday, August 26th in the year 2022, and today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. I would also like to thank you for making Locked on Buckeyes your first listen or first watch of every single day. On today's episode, we will be joined by the voice of the Ohio State Buckeyes, Mr. Paul Keels. Paul Keels and I had a fun conversation discussing the 0-2 season, what took place, some things that stood out from Jim Tressel, Mike Dawes, Matt Wilhelm, Maurice Claret, Craig Krenzel. We touch on numerous players, including Michael Jenkins. So trust me, Paul Keels, the voice, you recognize it. He's on every football game on the radio and basketball game as well. And I was just honored, and I feel privileged to have him here on the podcast to reminisce a little bit, get a little nostalgic, and discuss what took place during the 2002 football season where the Buckeyes won the national championship. And joining us now here on Locked on Buckeyes, it is the voice of the Ohio State basketball and football teams. It is Mr. Paul Keels. Paul, welcome to the podcast. How you doing today?
I'm doing good, Jay. Glad to be on with you.
This time of year, about 20 years ago, was a very special time for Ohio State football. They were preparing for what ended up being a national championship winning season, and you had the lucky seat, the privilege to be the voice of the Buckeyes. So you got to see things from a different perspective than anybody else. What do you remember about this time 20 years ago as the Buckeyes were embarking upon and getting ready to play a phenomenal season?
Well, Jay, Ohio State was coming off of Jim Tressel's first season as a head coach. They had lost their last two games at the end of that season, losing to Michigan, or actually beating Michigan, I'm sorry. They had lost the previous week to Illinois and then losing their bowl game to South Carolina. It was going to be a new quarterback in Craig Krenzel, who had quarterbacked them to their win in Ann Arbor over Michigan. But still a lot of questions. How was this team going to develop? And a lot of prognosticators really thought it could be the following year in 2003 that they could potentially challenge for a national championship. But they had an early start to the season, a late August game at home with Texas Tech in what was the Pigskin Classic. And Texas Tech had a quarterback whose name people may remember now, Cliff Kingsbury, and he was the one that people thought could be a Heisman candidate. And Ohio State was able to go out there and win that game decisively, and a freshman broke onto the scene by the name of Maurice Claret at running back. And people knew he was highly regarded, but what you had a chance to see on the field in that first game really wowed people. And it just kind of made you wonder, okay, if they can continue to play like this against an opponent like Texas Tech, then maybe there's some good things to come. But again, it's late August. You never really know for sure.
No, you don't know for sure. And I remember Claret and Krenzel and how there was some buzz around them, just real some speculation, but you just don't know. And even early in August, a lot can change September, October, November between the beginning of the season. As the season progresses, injuries happen, players get dinged up. And so not just after Tressel's first year, but even after that first game, people may have still been wondering, like, how special can this year be? Will this be a special season? Because, like you mentioned, it's so early.
It's so early. And also, Jay, what people may forget is Ohio State's bye week ended up being Labor Day weekend. So they played Texas Tech and then they had a bye week and didn't play again until the Saturday after Labor Day. But you knew that eventually there was a game with Washington State, a team that was very highly thought of, and then they would eventually get into the Big Ten and see how they would do. So you still really didn't know, but there were some encouraging things. You liked some of what was there potentially on defense. One of the other headlines really going into the season, Jay, was Michael Dawes had decided to come back for his senior season at strong safety. And clearly he could have gone to the NFL, but his goal was to win a national championship. And I think that resounded with his teammates. You saw the way he played, he did all of that. And you also really saw some of these players that had been playing for a while really elevate their play to a high level that took Ohio State where they ended up finishing.
How do you think Mike Dawes' return and staying in Columbus really impacted the defense during this year?
I think it was huge, and it really filtered down to the rest of that defense. And you had a lot of guys that had played a lot of football. Mike Dawes was lined up back there with Donnie Nicky. You had a linebacking group with Matt Wilhelm and C. Grant and Robert Reynolds, defensive linemen like Simon Frazier and Tim Anderson and the late Will Smith, who were guys that had played a lot of football, but really having somebody as highly regarded as Michael Dawes coming back seemed to be just, from as we viewed it in the press box and as you watched it from the outside looking in, to have an effect on the whole team. Really, here's a guy that could have left to go pro, but a guy that's bought in, and really his decision had a big impact on this team as they went from week to week through all of the close challenges that they faced.
Close challenges. You have a leader coming back. You have a freshman who you've mentioned, Maurice Claret. Do you remember him being were there any nerves? Was he nervous going into the first game or first few games of that year?
It didn't seem to be. Now, Maurice, because he was a freshman and because of how Coach Tressel kind of administered things with the media, you didn't get a lot of access to a lot of the players. So, and Maurice was the one that wasn't really interviewed a whole lot. I think they were kind of guarding him a little bit, but it certainly didn't seem to be the way he came out and immediately broke loose against Texas Tech, did the same thing against Washington State. He played like a guy that was older than his class designation was attached to him. Just the way he ran, for his size, he had speed that maybe fooled some people, because when he'd get in the open, and maybe not track speed, but just elusive speed, that really allowed him to break away from defenses. But no, would not think that he was nervous. At least it didn't show that he was nervous.
You mentioned the lack of ability to talk to Maurice Clarett, and then even just the team kind of guarding him. It's a lot different than it is nowadays, where training camp right now, fall camp, you get players speaking to the media every single day, and Stroud's a hot commodity, Trevin Henderson's a hot commodity. A lot of these guys, you expect to talk to them. Like, it's a complete change between what it was in 2002 and how it is right now in 2022.
No question it is. And certainly I think that a lot of that has to do with the head coaches. And one of the things that Jim Tressel eventually evolved to, he seemed to kind of get a grip on the fact that he needed to make some of the players more available. And obviously there are those that they want to have more in front of the media than some of the others, those who, speak very well, that present very well. And there was a lot of effort in later years under Coach Tressel's time that went in preparing players for that. But freshmen generally aren't given a lot of exposure right away. And, Maurice was one of those as a freshman, but also as a guy, I think there was a little concern. And don't mean anything underlying in that, but there was just a little hesitation about making him too terribly available.
He had the size of someone. You mentioned how he didn't really look and run or play like a guy who was a freshman. His size was not normal either. And I remember watching him during that year and just thinking about, he's a freshman, but there are guys that are juniors or seniors that aren't built like Maurice Clarett. And when he runs the ball, he utilized his size and the speed of which you spoke about so well. And he's still one of my favorite Buckeye running backs to watch, because even though it was just one season, which could be why he's so special, he did special things on the field. And I just loved watching him really run the ball consistently for Ohio State during that 1 year he was there.
Well, it was his size, it was his ability to get away. But Jay, if you think about his 1 year, there's two plays that can really think back that showed how he had such a big impact in them winning the national championship. Late in a game against Michigan, in a late drive, he catches a pass coming out of the backfield that keeps the drive going. Then Maurice Hall eventually ends up scoring the go-ahead touchdown. And then obviously in the national championship game against Miami, Craig Krenzel's throwing a ball into the end zone for what appeared it was going to be a touchdown to Ben Hartsock. It's intercepted by Sean Taylor, and as Taylor's returning the ball out of the end zone, Maurice Clarett strips the ball and takes it away from him. And if that doesn't happen, Miami maybe has generated enough momentum to make that game have a different outcome.
You mentioned that interception by Sean Taylor, and I was talking to one of my buddies who's an Ohio State fan recently, and I told him, I said, Sean Taylor, once he caught that pick, I know he was in the middle of the end zone, about 5-6 yards deep. I thought he was gone. I thought it was a touchdown. But Maurice Clarett didn't give up on the play, and he knew, hey, I can make a play. And maybe he thought to get a tackle, but Sean Taylor made a mistake running with the ball in the inside arm, not the outside arm. Maurice Claret did the unthinkable, really was unthinkable. I didn't think it was going to happen, and got the strip of that, and the Buckeyes end up winning the game. But that's still one of those plays to this day I still talk about how important it was, not just for Claret, but really for Ohio State to have a chance to win that game that day.
The other part of that, Jay, too, is if you remember, Sean Taylor went up the sideline. So the sideline's an extra defender. So the field was kind of being closed down on him a little bit. And while most everybody who are Ohio State fans are, maybe caught up in, oh my goodness, turned the ball over when it could have been a touchdown, Maurice Clarett and I'm sure others, they, go to the mindset of immediately you have to become defenders. And it was amazing to all of a sudden see the separation of bodies. And there's Maurice Clarett with a football. It really was in a game that had a number of game-changing plays. It was one of the biggest.
Chris Campbell this year was one of those players. I see the smile on your face as you immediately have some memories that pop into your head as soon as you hear his name. Playing both ways, actually all three facets, because he was on special teams as well. It doesn't happen today. It wasn't really happening at that time. But he was one of those players, and I remember rewatching the national championship game, and they talked about how he had played, I think, over 100 snaps the 3 previous games leading up until that day. And I'm like, that's insane, the conditioning, but also the mental capacity to be able to understand both 3 positions, returning the ball, then also being a corner and being a receiver, being able to handle all of that, and to still be able to be physically fit and well enough to not be unconditioned during crucial moments of games. Those were big. And I think his contributions, we talk about Claret, we talk about guys on defense, but Chris Campbell, offense, defense, doesn't matter. He was pivotal to this team and their success and really going undefeated in 2002.
Well, it was huge. And the door opened because of an injury. I believe it was Bobby Britton who had been playing cornerback, or maybe it was Richard McNutt. I can't remember, Jay, exactly which one. It might have been Richard McNutt. And we had been alerted to the fact that the coaches were practicing Chris Campbell at cornerback, but not to use the information until we actually saw him on the field in a game playing defense. And it may have been the Cincinnati game or maybe the Wisconsin game. The first rep he got on the field at cornerback, he gets an interception. And it really showed his value there. And the return part you mentioned, in a season of so many big plays, he was able to serve as a returner, but also an interception return against Penn State, maybe one of the loudest I've ever heard Ohio Stadium. And, in a game that Ohio State won without scoring an offensive touchdown in beating Penn State at home. So Chris Campbell was such an X factor, what he was able to do defensively, what he was able to do as an offensive threat paired with Michael Jenkins and Chris Vance's receivers. He was a guy that was such a huge part of what this team was able to do, and especially how they could implement him defensively where there was a need.
How do you think Jim Tressel handled this season?
Incredibly well. And Jay, the interesting thing about Jim Tressel's time, and the term became pretty popular during his time as a head coach, Tresselball. It was conservative on offense, a quarterback in Craig Krenzel who was so cerebral and could make big plays, but also could make plays that would keep him out of trouble. And Tressel used to always tell Craig Krenzel, throwing the ball away and punting is not the worst thing in the world. Jim Tressel always made mention of the fact that the punt sometimes was the most important play in a football game. But what allowed them to be able to function like that was having an outstanding and consistent punter in Andy Groom, great coverage teams, but also a defense that they could really, really rely on. And so what you saw Jim Tressel do in this season, after having had Steve Bellisari at quarterback the year before, and Steve was a guy that could be a threat running the ball as well as throwing. They could utilize him as a little of an option quarterback. Jim Tressel and his offensive staff tailored this offense to what their strengths were: experience on the line, playmakers at receiver, an outstanding running back as a freshman, but a quarterback who would most of the time keep him out of bad plays.
That's one thing that I think gets lost in all of this. We discussed Tresselball, and a lot of fans don't have. A lot of people I talk to, they're not too fond of Tresselball, but there's some wisdom in utilizing that philosophy, especially with this team, working to your strengths and allowing your strengths to really be what makes you great, and that's exactly what he did. So Tresselball might be something that is a little, maybe a bad thought in some people's mind or a sour moment, maybe. But he won, and he used his philosophy to win games, not just in this year, but even beyond that, making it to 2 more national championship games. So I really love Tressel, not just for him as a man and what he stands for, but also sticking to his philosophy and sticking to what he believes. Because of what he believes, he found something that worked. He had a philosophy that worked, and he rode that thing all the way through to the national championship game and won the Natty at the end.
And you saw in the later years when he had Troy Smith and when he had Ted Ginn and Anthony Gonzalez, where they could open up the offense more than they did in 2002. But it was he and his coaching staff just utilizing the strengths of their football team. And really, it was the Miami game, after all of the time that had elapsed between the Michigan win, where you saw how that defense and that defensive line really knocked the Hurricanes around. And you could tell that Ken Dorsey had not been harassed by a defense all year like he had with Ohio State's defense.
Oh, you're correct. I told you, I just mentioned, I rewatched the game, and I don't know if it was a first play, but I know that first series, the D-line set the tone in that game for how Miami was going to kind of view or how some changes they needed to make, because everybody's talking about the big bad Hurricanes and how they were this dynasty, won the national championship the year before, beating Nebraska really in convincing fashion. And so Miami's a hot team. They're the big name. Then you have Ohio State, who's an underdog, but by that D-line setting the tone, that also I do believe helped the offense kind of eventually get some things going. But that defense set the tone early, and you talk about it. That front four, physical, the front seven, really physical, strong, it imposed their will on the Hurricanes from the jump, and it really was what set the tone for the entire game.
I think it was the first play from scrimmage for Miami, and it may have been Simon Frazier who got past the offensive line and slammed into Ken Dorsey. And you could tell that Dorsey was a little caught off guard by how an opposing defense had gotten to him so easily, at least in one instance. And then, later on, you see what Dustin Fox was able to do in that game. There's the play with C. Grant harassing Dorsey at the end of the game when it was finally won. But that defense, really, when you look at both of those teams, but in particular, that defense, you look at the players that were out there on the field. Matt Wilhelm, who was just a warrior for years at middle linebacker. C. Grant, who came to Ohio State as a defensive back and had been a high school quarterback. Will Smith, who, had an incredible NFL career before his untimely death. Simon Frazier, who just, was a space eater on the line. Tim Anderson, a guy that doesn't get an awful lot of credit. David Thompson. There were so many of those players. And, think about the backups were A.J. Hawk and Bobby Carpenter. So, it was a defense that really had a great deal of talent, but they were able to have such an effect on slowing down the offenses that they faced, no more than, the powerful offense that Miami had.
We talk about the offense, the defense at Ohio State in this game, but this year, Michael Jenkins is one of those guys. I was a young Buckeye fan. I just gotten involved in college football, gravitated towards Ohio State. And I remember Michael Jenkins going to the NFL, and I was like, oh, snap, a receiver's in the NFL. I knew about Ohio State. I didn't know all the history about the school. But Michael Jenkins is one of those guys. If you talk to any Buckeye fan or just anyone during that year, they're going to say, well, this player sticks out and that player sticks out. Most people will recognize and remember Michael Jenkins, and his name will come up in a conversation about how important he was in this season for the Buckeyes to win the national championship.
We had a saying with Michael Jenkins and Craig Krenzel on our radio network, Krenzel to Jenkins, money in the bank. They just seem to have such a great chemistry with one another. And everybody remembers the big catch that he made against Purdue for a touchdown on fourth down to basically win a tight game. But also, the very next year, they use him as a punt returner, and he gets a punt return touchdown to help beat Iowa in a game in Columbus. He was dependable. He was a big target. And he was a guy that was a mismatch problem for opposing defensive backs. And, and the other thing that was just so complimentary about that Ohio State offense, when you had Michael Jenkins and Chris Campbell, you also had a tight end at Ben Hartsock, which a lot of people probably would say they think he was underutilized. But Ben was an incredible blocker as well as a receiver. You had the running threats that we talked about, not only with Maurice Claret, but Lydell Ross and Maurice Hall. an offensive line that was just full of guys that had opportunities in the NFL and played very well, led by a freshman center, Nick Mangold, who forced Alex Stepanovic to move to guard with how well he played. So, Michael Jenkins was dependable, but I think really, Jay, that whole offense thrived on the fact, yes, Clarett gets so much of the attention, but it was an offense that could do so many things.
What were some of the biggest moments you remember from that year from the offense?
Well, there's the fourth down that we talked about
Yes.
against Purdue. That's probably a signature moment that everybody makes, that everybody thinks about. Maurice Claret, who just, against Washington State had an incredible running game. I think certainly Chris Campbell, with all of the different things that he could do, had a lot to do with it. Maybe lost in all of it is the times that Craig Krenzel scored rushing touchdowns.
Yes.
When they were in the red zone. I mean, against Cincinnati, he had a touchdown. Against Miami, in overtime, he was able to score on the ground. So, there were so many of those type of moments. Maurice Hall, who had a game-winning touchdown at Illinois in Ohio State's first ever overtime game. He had the game-winning touchdown against Michigan on an option play. There were just so many of those type of plays. We mentioned the catch that Clarett had against Michigan. So many of those type of plays that really made them a team that had the potential to win big games and win a national championship.
What about defense? Same type of thing. What big plays, or what were some of the bigger plays you remember from that year?
Well, the pick six that Gamble had against Penn State was huge. He also had a late interception in a tight game at Wisconsin that kind of helped seal the deal. There were times I can recall Darian Scott, who played on the defensive line, with some of the crunching moves and hits that he made on opposing players. So many of them, when you think about having defensive backs like Michael Dawes, Donnie Nicky, Dustin Fox, guys that, really played their positions at a high level and were so incredibly consistent. Simon Frazier, we talked about the hit he had on Dorsey at the very beginning of the football game. Will Smith, who just, at times was unblockable. There were so many of those types of plays for this football team. But maybe a couple of them to highlight. Maybe the one to highlight is at the very end of the Michigan game. They're playing in Columbus against Michigan. And there's a pass that John Navarre's throwing to try and pull out a last-second victory for Michigan, and Will Allen gets an interception. Allen also had an interception in the win at Cincinnati that Matt Wilhelm tipped. So there was just like on offense, there were so many of those type of plays in this magical season.
Magical season. The Buckeyes are going to actually recognize that national championship winning team, I believe, against Notre Dame, if I'm correct with that. Mm-hmm. And so I love hearing your stories. I love just thinking about that year. What are some last thoughts or memories you have about that team that year, winning the national championship? You've referenced the Miami game, referenced a few other games as well. But what are some last thoughts and memories you have from that season?
Well, Jay, if you think about how college football has changed now, if there was a Big Ten championship game that year, Ohio State would have played Iowa, who was unbeaten in conference play, and had a Heisman Trophy finalist at quarterback in Brad Banks. With all of the near misses, would it have been one more chance to possibly lose a football game? And could that have kept them from playing in a national championship? The other thing that helped Ohio State dramatically, they were the only other unbeaten team in Division I beside Miami. Late in the year, Oklahoma was still trying to make a push to get in there, but they lost a game. So it was just one of those things where everything fell into place properly, given the environment. It was a two-team national championship with a BCS system. There was no Big Ten championship game. There was nobody in the SEC that was crashing the party. It was just one of those seasons that I don't know that we could ever see when you think about all of those elements, that we could see a team and have so many close calls and win and get an opportunity to play for a national championship, let alone to win one.
Paul Keels, the voice of the Buckeyes, was right there, had a phenomenal seat in view for what was a magical season in Columbus as Ohio State won the national championship during the 2002 season. That team will be recognized September 3rd during the Notre Dame game, and I'm happy Paul Keels is able to come on the podcast and share some of those stories and memories with us. Paul, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Glad to do it, Jay. Take care.